It's been a challenging year for producers in Nebraska, and that goes for alfalfa growers too. This week, Market Journal's Bill Dodd spoke with an expert to get an update on the popular forage. Bill, how are things looking for alfalfa producers, and what do we need to keep in mind as we make our way through fall?
Thanks, Troy. It's no secret that precipitation has been above average for many producers here in Nebraska and the Corn Belt in general this growing season. We've seen many negative effects on corn and soy crops as well, and alfalfa hasn't been without a few problems of its own. This year has been the wettest 12-month period in the 124 years of record keeping in the continental United States, and the effects of all the rain and runoff are still being felt as producers head into the fields for harvest. When it comes to alfalfa, some producers are in a good position as we head into October. However, according to Nebraska Extension Forage expert Bruce Anderson, some of the dry periods producers depend on were few and far between in some areas, causing a disruption in regular hay quality and harvest practices.
Well, alfalfa's kind of been up and down. You know, it really needs to have some dry periods in order to make decent hay off of it. And we haven't had a lot of those nice long dry periods to get good hay put up. So while we may have had good tonnage in some situations because of the plentiful moisture, getting good quality hay off of that has really been a struggle. Because of all of these in and out wet periods that we've had during the year, many growers have not been able to hit maybe the type of harvest schedule that they'd like to have. And as a result, we have some folks with fields that, maybe a foot and a half tall and just looking beautiful for taking a late cutting. Others have just taken a harvest maybe a couple weeks ago and won't have another chance for another cutting this year because of the slow growth rate that we see in October and late in the year. So we really have kind of alfalfa fields right now that are what I'd say is in all sorts of different conditions, but most of them have probably had fewer harvests or later harvests than what they normally would in a regular growing season.
As we get into this time of year, Bruce tells me it becomes a bit of a tough decision as to whether or not to take a cutting due to the fact that producers are entering what some consider the prime winterizing period for an alfalfa crop, as it's going through the process of putting nutrients down into the root system in order to help with winter hardiness and contribute to substantial growth for the following season.
The winterizing period on the alfalfa we generally think of as lasting in Nebraska from about mid-September to mid-October, and that's the time frame when the plants are really sending a lot of the nutrients that they produce in photosynthesis down into the root system so that those nutrients will be able to support the plant over the winter time. And so harvest during that time period removes that photosynthetic capacity for the plant. It's going to draw some of the nutrients out of the root system. As a result, if we were to take a cutting at this time of the year, we're going to weaken those plants to some degree. Now, a lot of times we get by with that pretty effectively, especially if we've had something in the neighborhood of 6 weeks or more since the previous cutting. Then the alfalfa is in pretty good shape and we can do that. If, though, we have had a shorter time period before that cutting is going to take place, I think producers really ought to either think of doing one of two things. That is, delaying that harvest until after about mid-October, when the plants will have been what I'd say fully winterized and a harvest won't hurt them, or if they have the livestock capability to look at potentially grazing that alfalfa as a way of getting a harvest off of that final growth.
As producers are preparing to graze alfalfa, Bruce tells me it's typically best to wait until we've seen 1 or 2 good hard freezes. This will help ensure good growth during the next season, as well as help firm up the soil in order to keep hoof damage on the ground to a minimum. Beyond that, Bruce explains this practice could also benefit the animals that are grazing.
The hard freezes also do another thing. They change the makeup of some of the chemicals in the alfalfa plant as the plant starts to dry down from the freezing. So as a result, the compounds that can cause bloat in the animals start to be reduced to some extent. As a result of doing all of that, then they can graze much more safely with the animals. If the plants are still real green, especially if they're real lush and green, then we need to take a few of the precautions that are necessary to reduce the likelihood of bloat. Things like feeding the animals real well prior to turning them onto the alfalfa. Things like making sure that we turn them on when the alfalfa is real dry. So typically that's going to be mid to late morning or later in the day. especially avoiding when there's any dew or irrigation water or anything like that on the plants, because that really increases the bloat risk out there. And just making sure that the animals are never real hungry at the time that they're grazing the alfalfa, so they don't take in these big fast meals that can kind of overload that system and result in some of the bloat that alfalfa can cause.
And with fall calving season upon us as well, Bruce says grazing alfalfa can be a good source of nutrition for recently weaned calves as long as the crop has gone through a couple of hard freezes. However, he did warn that producers may want to be mindful of balancing nutritional needs as alfalfa has a high protein to energy ratio. Now, if you'd like more information from Bruce regarding alfalfa or forage, you can check out any of his articles at cropwatch.unl.edu. And Troy, that's what I've got my eye on this week. We'll send it back to you.